Good morning, and thank you for attending the OALA's Continuing Education Seminar organized by our Continuing Education Committee. Werner Schwar, our CE committee member, will introduce our speaker today. But before I pass the microphone to Werner, I'll note a few housekeeping items. You'll note that as attendees, you're all muted. For this webinar, we'll keep everyone muted, and if you have questions, please type them in the questions box, and we will have a question and answer session after the presentation. And you can type in your question at any time during the presentation, and we'll be posing them at the end to our speaker. And this webinar will be recorded, and we'll post it on a link in the OALA members area the website, and we'll also be sending a link to anyone who has attended today, so you'll be able to rewatch the webinar. The email with the recording will also have a short survey with it, and that helps the CEC to prepare future webinars. So if you have a chance, please take it. It takes less than 2 minutes. And you'll also receive a certificate that you can download to confirm your attendance. And OALA members may submit 1 CE credit for attending the webinar or for watching it on your own time. So with those quick things, I'm now happy to pass over the microphone to Werner to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Ingrid, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. Today I have the pleasure of introducing our presenter and acting as moderator for today's webinar entitled Bylaws, Biodiversity, and Property Standards, Reforming Municipal Grass and Weeds Bylaw in Support of Climate Resilience. So to start things off today, those of you in the audience, could you please write the name of your own location in the questions box so that we have a sense of the geographical range of our audience for today? And please do that within the next minute or so. I personally have the good fortune of speaking to you today from Thunder Bay, where I drink the water of Gichigumi, breathe the air in the shadow of Anamiku-Aju, and share the land that is on the traditional territory of the Fort William First Nation, which was a signatory to the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850, as well as with the Anishinaabe Nation and Métis people. And first, we'd like to begin our webinar with a land acknowledgement. Please place your feet on the ground and breathe the air at your location. We recognize that our work takes place on traditional Indigenous territories across Ontario. We also wish to acknowledge that the Ontario Association of Landscape Architects head office is located on the traditional Indigenous territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently the territory of Mississaugas of the New Credit. The territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. We acknowledge that Ontario is home to First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people from many territories, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to meet and work with them. Now I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker today, Lorraine Johnson, who I believe is broadcasting from Toronto as well, so in the same land as the land acknowledgement I just gave. And Lorraine is probably best known to many of the OALA members as the founding and longtime editor of Ground, the Landscape Architect Quarterly. More recently, she's the author of more than 10 books and currently has authored a book with Sheila Kola and is entitled A Garden for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee, Creating Habitat for Native Pollinators, Ontario edition, which was published in the spring in Canada, and the US edition is being published currently by Island Press for release next spring. And she's also been a real tireless champion advocating for change in municipal bylaws relating to naturalizing gardens. So please help me in welcoming Lorraine to begin her presentation.
Thanks so much, Werner, for that introduction. Hello, everybody. Thanks to the OALA for hosting. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be speaking with everyone today. Can you see my screen? Everything's good? Okay. As Werner said, I am joining this digital space from Treaty 13 territory. And I do just want to draw our attention to one of the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, where it talks about the requirement of reconciliation with the natural world. And that if human beings resolve the problems between ourselves, but continue to destroy the natural world, then reconciliation remains incomplete. So I'm hoping that we can keep that in mind with what we're speaking about today, what we're talking about. And when we think about something that may seem like grass and weeds bylaws, how do these connect? I hope that this webinar today will really talk about, will kind of focus on how these bylaws really are of great significance in terms of reconciling with the natural world, and also in terms of climate resilience, the need for climate resilience, and the imperative of supporting biodiversity. So I got involved in this issue because I write books on naturalization and gardening with native plants and regenerating habitat. And people kept getting in touch with me about bylaw problems they were having when they were doing what, you know, my books and the books of others and various environmental organizations and nature clubs were encouraging people to do, which was creating habitat. But people were running into problems with the grass and weeds bylaws, and also with the noxious weeds list, because of course, until very recently, milkweeds, the only known larval host plant for the endangered monarch butterfly, was on the provincial noxious weed list. So people were having problems doing this work, this important, crucial work of restoring or regenerating habitat, and they were getting in trouble because of bylaws. So it occurred to me, and I realized that these bylaws are very powerful disincentives, and they discourage the environmental actions we need to take. So the context for this talk is climate resilience and biodiversity. And so it's incredibly clear, I think we could all agree, what the science is saying we need to do in response to biodiversity loss and climate change. And one of the things we need to do in terms of kind of landscape, some of the things we need to do are very clearly presented by groups like the National Academy of Sciences here in their special issue devoted to insect decline. It was published recently, 2021. And the major actions that they recommend individuals can take to save insects from global decline and support biodiversity is: one, convert lawns into diverse natural habitats, grow native plants, reduce pesticide and herbicide use. So it's very clear that the ways that we can have a positive impact on this biodiversity loss and promote climate resilience in the landscape by converting lawns into diverse natural habitats. So in this context of, you know, speaking of your work as landscape architects, whether you work for a municipality or are on staff within municipality or do other kinds of client work. So I'd like to ask, I really think there's a basic question. Does your municipality and its grass and weeds bylaws either support these three crucial actions that all the scientists are saying we need to take in the landscape, or do the grass and weeds bylaws in your municipalities discourage and disincentivize and even punish this work of reducing or converting lawns into diverse natural habitat and growing native plants? So many municipalities have these great policies around biodiversity or pollinators or climate change, but they also have these grass and weeds bylaws. And I've just shown one example from the city of Hamilton, but I could have picked one from anywhere. These bylaws undermine those very policies that municipalities have around biodiversity and climate change and pollinator support. And these bylaws, I have to say, are rigorously enforced. Just in Toronto, for example, there's about 6,000 complaints that are investigated a year, happened during the pandemic as well. And so right there, I would argue that these bylaws undermine that first important action that the scientists are telling us to take in terms of converting lawns into diverse habitats. I also want to stress that just the language of the names of these bylaws, grass and weeds, that term, I do, because I write books about native plant gardening and creating habitat, I give, I've been giving talks to gardening groups and horticultural societies for about 30 years. I talk about native plant gardening. The first thing I ask those audiences is, what is the first word that comes to mind when I say the word native plants? Inevitably, what they respond with is weeds. So out there in the general public, there is an overwhelming idea that native plants are weeds. So every municipality has a bylaw that's called grass and weeds bylaw. So people are thinking right off the bat, oh, I'm not allowed to plant native plants, or they're regulated in some way, or there's something wrong. So the details vary, but bylaws pretty much always start from a premise that properties must be maintained to a certain standard, and that standard is clipped lawns, usually to a height of 20 centimeters or 8 inches, and that the landscape not contain so-called weeds. And if you don't have a lawn, but you have other plants, that they're intensively managed in some way. So lawn grass is not allowed to flower. No spontaneous vegetation is allowed to flower, and certainly not to go above 8 inches. So there's no pollen or nectar. And I think we need to ask ourselves, why do municipalities have these bylaws in the first place? So the context, the way that they started anyway, really relates to this agricultural history of regulation of agricultural weeds, so plants that really interfered with agriculture, and that's why the noxious weeds list was developed. But then the property standards bylaws, well, some municipalities started to use that agricultural context as the basis for the regulation of weeds, despite the fact that many of the agricultural weeds have literally no impact in the urban context. And then these property standards bylaws started to stray out of the agricultural realm into the realm of regulating aesthetics, a standard look. And they started to punish deviance from that standard look with fines, et cetera. So I just want to go through some examples of the enforcement of these laws and some of the court cases that have been fought over them, and some of the significant advancements that have happened as a result of these court cases. Sandy Bell, she was fined $50 for this. This is her yard. It was in the early 90s. I went to visit it. This is the yard, and she was fined for it. She had to pay. She appealed that ruling to the Ontario Court of Justice, and the judgment was groundbreaking. She was basically doing a charter challenge to her right under the Charter's, our protected freedom of expression right, and she was saying that she was expressing her environmental values through this landscaping, and the court agreed with her. The court ruled that the bylaw, the grass and weeds bylaw, and if you, the Toronto, so this was in Toronto, and the Toronto bylaw has changed since the Sandy Bell court case. But if you look at most bylaws across Ontario, they use very similar language to the bylaw that was in place in Toronto during the Sandy Bell court case. And the court ruled that the bylaw was vague and therefore unenforceable, and that the city was overstepping its powers in regulating aesthetics, and that this had the effect of outlawing natural gardens. So the courts found Toronto's then bylaw and bylaws that are a bylaw that is very similar to bylaws that exist across Canada today. The bylaw was found invalid for violating the charter because it violated freedom of expression. So the Sandy Bell case led to the City of Toronto introducing a natural garden exemption, which I'll get into in a bit more detail in a moment. And I want to really discourage other municipalities from following that route of coming up with a natural garden exemption in order to make a bylaw conform to the rules. So there's lots of stuff we could talk about. While that case was going on, I went photographing councillors' lawns. I went photographing places in the city where the city itself was growing grasses, such as this big blue stem grass, native grass, over 20 centimeters. Most municipalities' bylaws don't define grass. So when the bylaw is arbitrarily enforced, native grasses are included, and it's up to a bylaw enforcement's arbitrary discretion to determine which grasses to regulate. And I think as landscape architects, you'd agree about the complexity of identifying and defining grasses. There are literally thousands of species. So, and here's the thing about arbitrary enforcement. We know from every aspect of regulation and our systems that we have in place, we know that arbitrary enforcement disproportionately affects marginalized people and those without power or voice or resources or privilege. So the arbitrary enforcement is definitely a problem with these bylaws. Another court case that had a profound effect was the Douglas Counter court case in the early 2000s, where he fought right up to the Ontario Superior Court and won the constitutionally protected, or reinforced the decision in the Sandy Bell decision about the constitutional right to express your environmental values. But where the Counter case expanded this is because Douglas was gardening on the, he was creating habitat on the public boulevard. So that court case affirmed the charter right to express your environmental values on this public space of the boulevard or the public right of way, subject only to health and safety restrictions, very clear health and safety restrictions. So there's so many ironies with these cases. You know, while this was going on, Douglas's garden was on a stamp. Anyway, it was an incredible ruling affirming the right to free expression, to create these sorts of gardens on the boulevard. Very important. But that didn't protect Douglas. He got a challenge from the city in 2019, even though the case was decided in the early 2000s. Some other examples I'll just run through very quickly. Deb Dale's Scarborough Boulevard garden, the city cut it down. And here's another irony about how one arm of the municipal, the way that municipalities have these wonderful policies, but then their grass and weed, policies on biodiversity, et cetera, or stormwater management, for example, and yet on the other hand, have these grass and weeds bylaws that completely undercut those policies. So, for example, Deb Dale's garden was a finalist in the water conservation category of the 2008 Toronto Green Awards. A week before her garden was cut, she taught a seminar funded by the city and the TRCA on how to create downspout bog gardens. And one of the most poignant details of what happened to Deb, I think, is that she phoned the police. When she came home, saw her garden and her boulevard cut, she phoned the police to report the destruction, only to be told that the city was the one who cut it. Another example from a landscape architect, Miriam Mouton's Boulevard in Coburg was cut down 3 times by the town. And then during, it was also actually cut down 1 time while she was chairing the Public Works Department meeting. You can see during drought what happens to most boulevards in Coburg with grass, whereas the way that Miriam's Boulevard is thriving. Or Doreen Nickel, who was ordered to remove the milkweed plants from her garden in June 2018, and it led to, because she fought back, it led to the city of Burlington removing milkweed from the weed list, but it was still there. Or this gardener cut down, or the example in Mississauga where there was a policy that you could not grow anything other than grass on your boulevard, and Jean McWright fought that and created an organization called Blooming Boulevards to work with the city to create native plant habitat on boulevards. So they're just, these are only a few of the examples. Very recently, Nina Marie Lister, an OALA honorary member and a well-respected public urban planner, teaches at Toronto Metropolitan University, winner of the Margolis Prize, an incredibly respected um, urban planner and designer. This is her yard where she has created a meadow that is maintained. It's maintained weekly. Someone comes through weekly to maintain it. It's based on nature's habitat. She received, it has more conventional areas. Here's one of the eco-man who maintains it. Well, she was cited as a violation, her yard being in violation quite recently. Here's another example during the pandemic. A friend of mine, you can see she was cited for having goldenrod. This is her yard. You can see it's kept from overhanging the sidewalk. Again, arbitrary enforcement. There are 12 other gardens on the block that have goldenrod. Goldenrod's not listed as a noxious weed in the provincial legislation. It's not listed by the City of Toronto, but this bylaw enforcement officer gave her a citation, and she was ordered, it's a violation, she was ordered to cut down her goldenrod, a wonderful pollinator plant. I want to acknowledge that I'm not going to talk about food gardens at all or medicine gardens, and that could be another whole topic. Now, I mentioned natural garden exemptions and that I wanted to speak briefly about them. It might seem counterintuitive, but a number of places in Toronto up until last year dealt with this issue around the court rulings and thinking, well, okay, we want to promote, or the court has told us we need to, and many places such as Toronto wanted to promote natural gardens, certainly in some policies. So they came up with, and I hear municipalities considering starting to have natural garden exemptions. And it might seem counterintuitive, but these are terrible. Just consider the message that an exemption promotes, that a natural garden is somehow outside of the norm. It's not okay just automatically, but it has to be approved. It has to be inspected. There has to be some kind of process that it goes through for approval. And okay, so those are the big, I think, philosophical problems with it. But just in terms of like coming up with a bylaw, how do you define natural gardens? It is basically a meaningless term. And you can see from the way I've highlighted there, the way that the Toronto Grass and Weeds bylaw until last year, when it got rid of the natural garden exemption, or actually this year, when it got rid of the natural garden exemption, thank goodness. But look at that definition. It's completely vague and meaningless. But this exemption tells everyone's neighbors that somehow what you're doing is suspect and not quote unquote normal and requires approval. So just as the science is telling us that the number one action we can take is to convert lawns into natural habitats, municipalities with these exemptions are empowering individuals to feel entitled to complain, or actually with any bylaw, actually whether there's an exemption or not, municipalities are complicit in encouraging that complaint by treating natural gardens as somehow suspect or need to be exempted or not what we want to promote as the norm. Or if they're not discouraged, if you don't think that they're actually discouraging them, most municipalities certainly have no disincentives to complaint. There's no barrier that people have to reach before they complain about their neighbor's yard. They don't even have to identify the quote unquote weeds that are a problem. So, for example, my friend's neighbor thought goldenrod was a quote unquote weed, not a fantastic native pollinator plant. And the bylaw ends just phone 311, and the inspector came out, went, yeah, that's a weed, wrote the violation notice ordering to cut. And so what about people who don't want to go to the work of having to defend their yards? You're automatically ensuring that they won't create naturalized landscapes if you have this kind of if you have these sorts of really vague and arbitrary bylaws, and especially those natural garden exemptions. So, and I've just included here some examples of comments I've collected from Facebook groups about people being worried about planting native plant or pollinator supporting gardens or natural gardens for fear of being visited by bylaw officers. These really are powerful disincentives. And these are comments on gardening sites. So imagine the people who aren't gardeners and so who want to do something positive. They're going to be so hesitant to wade into this territory of creating natural gardens. I mean, if people who are pretty familiar with gardening and all the conventions of gardening and knowledgeable about gardening are kind of discouraged from doing it, think about even starting to garden. So if you're someone with a yard and you've heard about the biodiversity crisis and pollinator decline and the need for climate resilience, and you want to do something, what is more likely to lead you to reaction or to some kind of action? All these grass and weeds bylaws with vague limit language prohibiting weeds, but no list and nothing higher than 8 inches, or a clear bylaw that lists what plants you must avoid because they're a threat to health and safety. So bylaws that conform to the court decisions, bylaws that have clear guidelines about height, that focus on safety and sight lines and not aesthetics. I think it's pretty clear which of those two options supports that #1 action that the National Academy of Sciences says that we need to take. And I'd argue that the current bylaws instead create this culture of complaint, especially when the enforcement, and there's lots we could say about enforcement issues, but when most places, when there's a complaint to, sort of 311 or the equivalent or to a counselor, automatically an advisory notice is sent. And these advisory notices, again, can be so terrifying to people, especially people who aren't necessarily gardeners or, they're like, okay, I'm doing something wrong, I gotta stop. And this is really not the way to support. And I just want to detour very briefly, because we want to leave lots of time for questions. I want to detour to something I hear a lot, and especially from professional designers and also from keen gardeners and from some people in the native plant movement. And they sometimes argue that there are ways to design a natural garden so that the neighbors don't complain. And I would call this blaming the victim. I'd also call this very naive, because it's assuming that neighbors never fight and neighbors never use available instruments such as vague bylaws to cause trouble for neighbors they don't like. So some of this narrative from professional designers and keen gardeners can go the route of saying that all the gardener needs to do is make the landscape beautiful, attractive, and well designed, and then there won't be any problems. And they say that messy, quote unquote, messy yards harm the native plant movement and give it a bad reputation. I would say that this is an attitude of kind of gatekeeping, and that it suggests that there are these standards, aesthetic standards, that are universal and must be shared. I would say that that is very elitist and also classist, because it's based on the assumption that everyone has the time and money and resources to either become, to learn the design, quote unquote, rules that everyone must apparently conform to, or hire a designer. And so I think it's highly problematic. I think as well, I think it's clear, cultural norms and the cultural shift that we need to have happen towards converting lawns to habitat, because that's something we need to do for climate resilience and to reverse biodiversity loss. I think these cultural norms only change because of people pushing at the edges. And given what's at stake, shouldn't we actually be supporting people who are pushing at the edges? So whether those are, landscape architects and designers who are pushing at the edges, or people with zero design training who are basically just want to have a yard that is going to do something to support pollinators and support biodiversity. And just again, I can't resist just really asking us the question of, does the lawn, which is what these grass and weeds bylaw uphold, does the lawn even need or deserve defending? It's a colonial landscape for sure. It's very much connected with colonization. We could talk about that for a long time. But the ecological costs of lawns are very clear. And the irony, of course, is that there's this private yards property bylaw that really goes after landholders, like who are, their yards, front yards, backyards, whatever. Cities themselves are the worst offenders of being in contravention of grass and weeds bylaws. So I know that the main consideration for municipalities is municipalities want a mechanism for dealing with abandoned properties, and councillors want to not have constituent phone calls night and day during the spring with people complaining about quote unquote weeds. So municipalities want these mechanisms to go after homeowners who basically let their yards go, like the city has in this slide. But if our property standards bylaws focused on health and safety and conform to those court decisions, there would be a simple mechanism to deal with any growth of plants that cause harm or damage to, or that threaten health or safety. So for example, invasive plants that cause harm to natural areas, list them and prohibit them so that if someone lets their lawn go and those plants that are listed and defined by a municipality as causing demonstrable harm to natural areas or to people, let's say something like ragweed or giant hogweed. Well, if you list those prohibited plants, then the municipality has a mechanism. Or, the plants that cause harm to humans, poison ivy, same thing, list them, prohibit them. If they show up in an abandoned property, then the municipality has a mechanism to deal with them. So the courts have ruled time and again in those cases I've talked about that the bylaws have to be enforced, can't be vague. They need clarity. And I would say that the definition of arbitrary is to say that you can't grow quote unquote weeds and then to not say what those weeds are, or to say that you have to keep grasses, of which there are hundreds and hundreds of species at 20 centimeters, or the language of bylaws that talk about tidiness or keeping it not unsightly. Those are incredibly vague terms. So in conclusion, I'd really like to urge you as landscape architects to use your voice and whatever power you have within your municipality or with your clients to advocate. So for those of you who work in municipalities, to advocate for clear and enabling bylaws that support rather than punish biodiversity, and that help create this change in attitudes and a culture of celebration of the whole continuum of landscapes, from wild growth to designed habitat gardens, instead of this culture of complaint and the municipal complicity in creating that culture of complaint. And I hope I've shown that it's possible to have these bylaws, these grass and weeds bylaws that both support biodiversity and deal with any real threats to human health and safety and ecological health, and that these bylaws need to be clear and not based on aesthetics, because the stakes really could not be higher. Thanks so much, and now we can turn to some questions and discussion. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Lorraine, for that great presentation. I think you've given us some marching orders as landscape architects. I would like to ask you the first question, but I invite the audience out there to put your questions in the question box, and Ingrid and I will be monitoring those and trying our best to ask Lorraine those questions so that she doesn't have to look at that box. We'll try to do that for her. My question is, and you've talked about landscape architects advocating for both in the consulting role, but as municipal staff. But do you think there's a single one thing that would be best for us to do to legitimize and advocate for natural gardens as the normal rather than the outlier?
Yeah, I do. And thanks for asking that great question. I really think that as landscape professionals with a very clear mandate that you have as professionals around being a leading profession in terms of climate resilience. I think landscape architects have an incredibly well-respected voice and a lot of power. So I think, as I said, advocating within your municipality. I also think just becoming familiar, like reading your municipality's wherever. So this is kind of both as professionals, but also even if you're not working within a city as the landscape architect in a municipality, but if you're working with clients in whatever municipality, look at the grass and weeds bylaws. Look at what they say. Reach out to councillors and others to advocate for change within those bylaws. Actually take a leadership role. I think the profession, I think the OALA could get involved and take a leadership role in terms of advocating, because it strikes me what other profession is going to be advocating for this change? Who else is going to lead this? Councillor? Politicians aren't going to lead it, because as I said, all they want is not to be bothered by constituents complaining about dandelions. That's their main thing. So who else is going to lead this change? Yes, individuals have. I use the examples of Sandy Bell and Douglas Counter. There are tons of other examples of people fighting this, but the assistance, support, and voice of landscape professionals would be a game changer. I mean, anyway, so I also think that something that landscape architects can do, along with, advocating on this issue, is take a look at, and I'm sorry, I intended to include a slide with this written down, but take a look at the many resources on this issue that are publicly available online, that were prepared by the Ecological Design Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University. So that's Professor Nina Marie Lister's lab, the Ecological Design Lab, where there are toolkits for municipalities around revising their bylaws. There's a sample, a model bylaw, a model grass and weeds bylaw that supports biodiversity, that was prepared by one of Nina Marie Lister's graduate students, Carly Murphy, as her major research project. She compared grass and weeds bylaws from across the country and looked at their deficiencies, looked in terms of supporting biodiversity and in terms of conforming to the legal, the court cases. And she wrote a model bylaw that any municipality is welcome to use and is encouraged to use to have a grass and weeds bylaw that supports biodiversity. So that's another thing that landscape architects can do, is take a look at those resources on the Ecological Design Lab's website at Toronto Metropolitan University. It's Nina Marie Lister's lab, and there's loads of wonderful materials. There are also materials, they were working with the Biophilic Cities Network on this issue. So those are a couple of things. And I think just talking with clients, clients have the same fears and concerns that individuals have, that I talked about with their yards and how to create habitat but not run afoul of these bylaws. So talk to your clients about this stuff. Talk with them about the value of habitat, and about maybe altering maintenance practices. I mean, so many clients, I'm sure, are, especially in the residential, corporate, wherever, municipal, they're cutting down the stalks and dead stalks. They're getting rid of leaves instead of leaving the leaves. And these are the sorts of aesthetic issues very much related to this culture of complaint I've talked about the bylaws encouraging. we have these ideas about maintenance and aesthetics that are very much out of sync with what the science is telling us and what many municipalities have in terms of their policies to support pollinators or climate resilience or biodiversity.
I'd agree wholeheartedly with you. In case of Thunder Bay, we just went through a painful bylaw rewrite, and those resources you mentioned help the public be able to submit that to our bylaw office, and that really changed everything. Once there was credible resources out there, they changed their tune, and voila, we had something more progressive. So thanks for those resources. So we do have a bunch of questions here.
And Rainer, before you, I was looking at the questions, and what you just mentioned about Thunder Bay starts to respond to one of them, where they're asking, are there any municipalities that actually have some good examples to offer? And so I don't know if Thunder Bay is one, or if either of you know of another place for people to look for good examples.
I think in the case of Thunder Bay, we referenced the Toronto one and those resources that Lorraine was talking about.
Yeah. I would also suggest checking out, and this is thanks to the work that Carly Murphy did in her paper that is readily available and in drawing up the model bylaw. The city of Fredericton has a very clean, simple, clear bylaw that's worth looking at. Definitely check it out. And then the one thing I would say about the Toronto bylaw that just went through a huge process, I was very involved in advocating and with a group of people, including Anina Marie Lister, Landscape Ontario, numerous groups involved in advocating for this revisions to the Toronto Grass and Weeds bylaw. I would say that there are still some issues with it, but there are some great advances, like naming the grass, naming the prohibited weeds. That's fantastic. But there are still issues around enforcement. If there is not some kind of, I would argue anyway, if there isn't some kind of, I think municipalities really need to consider how many resources they want to put to helping neighbors fight battles. How many we all know of the limited resources that municipalities have. So automatically sending out a notice or an officer without even knowing that there is in fact a problem, without someone actually having to say, well, there's such and such a prohibited plant in this, or, it gets hard to, anyway. Enforcement, we haven't really talked about it very much, but it's key.
I think this one question is maybe directed to you and the OALA in general, but do you think if the OALA could promote the understanding and premises of native gardenings, that would help? And I think they're suggesting maybe having seminars with the bylaw managers to get the word out on ground level and inspectors' attitudes. That may be a future CEC webinar in there, but also I think that the question for you is, again, how do you think best the OALA, and whether that be continuing education or the committee or the association itself, could help with the understanding of not only the term native gardening, but what that all entails?
Yeah, okay, I love that question. Thanks so much. I think it's a great idea. I would love it if the OALA got more involved in this, advocating around this stuff, and really maybe doing, coming up with a statement of some sort around this and presenting it maybe jointly with a group like the Federation of Canadian Municipalities or the Ontario counterpart, or submitting it to every municipality, submitting that statement to every municipality in Ontario, saying, look, we're the landscape professionals and we have within our mandate to protect and enhance biodiversity and help create climate resilience. So you've got these bylaws that work against this. So here's our statement. So I think that would have a strong impact. or to work with, anyway, related professions and come up with something, some kind of statement. But I just want to note, the question talked about native plants in particular, and obviously, that's what I write books about. I'm a huge proponent of native plants and creating habitat, and I think creating habitat with native plants is particularly important. But I'm also a very strong defender of the value and importance of a continuum, actually. And that continuum, the bottom of it is mown lawn. In terms of ecological value, in fact, I would say even harm, the bottom is mown lawn. And then moving up to unmown lawn, and then maybe, unmown lawn that has been colonized or whatever with volunteer plants, so that are allowed to flower and above 8 inches, and then moving up, let's say, to a garden of non-native plants, and then to a garden of fully maybe a mix of native and non-native plants, and then to a garden entirely of native plants to the local area. That's a continuum in terms of habitat value. So I really want to stress that when I'm talking about revising grass and weeds bylaws, I'm not talking about mandating the use of native plants for private yards. Now, I certainly see the value of municipalities moving in the direction of saying, hey, you know what, for all our public projects, we're, as many municipalities do now with street trees, sticking to native trees. But I think that this culture change that needs to happen, and that we're in the midst of around the aesthetics of this stuff, of these issues, I think that we're going to be a lot better off in the long run if we also have enabling bylaws that mean, that aren't restricted to native plants. Although obviously, in terms of habitat value, all the science tells us that in terms of habitat value, an entirely native plant habitat is going to be hugely more valuable in terms of biodiversity and pollinator support, et cetera, than a non-native landscape. So there's lots of subtlety, I think, and nuance in this stuff, but yeah.
And the next question actually sort of relates to that, taking it one step further. So you get all that enabling legislation, you get the bylaws in, you get sort of buy-in from general public and even municipality. And then we have bylaw officers issuing citations. And how do we address the sort of training of those that are issuing the citations to get on board when the general public may be still not on board?
That is such a good question. And I think this is such a tricky thing, because bylaw officers, and I know there's a little bit of a narrative that can come up in this work around reforming bylaws where, we just have a gut reaction to, I'm speaking personally here, to kind of blame the bylaw officer and the enforcement and, think it's adversarial in some way. But you know what, I've met a lot of these bylaw officers because I've been lucky enough to go on a lot of the enforcement calls, actually, to see what sorts of gardens are regulated. And, their bylaw enforcement officers are charged with they have to be experts in so many different areas. They have to, it's huge. So many of these grass and weeds bylaws then call on them to be horticultural experts as well, which is hugely unfair to these folks. So I think one of the ways to get around that is, and I think something that makes perfect sense is actually have this, and what I've advocated for, and what, for example, the City of Toronto has now done, is to include the list of regulated plants, prohibited plants, and they're prohibited on health and safety grounds, and those grounds extend to the health and health of natural areas. So it includes, plants like dog strangling vine, which they're not, along with plants like ragweed and poison ivy and giant hogweed, which have human impacts. So name the plants, train bylaw officers to identify those plants, and that's the end. That's it for the weeds. It's only those plants, and have some kind of mechanism for if they're having trouble identifying. But that would, whether it's a city horticulturist or whatever, but really try to limit the amount of times, or that another city position is called in to go and inspect over someone growing goldenrod. Like, that just should not happen. We're in a biodiversity and climate crisis, and cities say they don't have the money to do what they need to do, and they're still like spending the resources on that. So educate the officers around the prohibited weeds, and that's it. But even there's some, I meant to include a slide showing the Canada thistle, which is a regulated, agricultural weed. It's on a lot of weed lists that municipalities have. And then show a photo of the field thistle, which is one of the most pollinator supporting native plants around. And up there with goldenrods, asters, sunflowers, and coneflowers as incredibly supportive native plants. So the native thistles, I would say that it's very hard to tell for anyone other than a highly trained botanist to really tell the difference between those plants. So you're still going to run into trouble, but I think bylaw officer training, naming the weed, the prohibited plants, and also, I unfortunately, I don't think it's ever going to happen, but having some kind of bar, like low bar, can be a super low bar. Hey, you're complaining about a neighbor's yard. What is the problem? That what is the problem is not asked right now anywhere.
So next question is, we had a question about people or municipalities with bylaws, but are there municipalities that are doing well with the biodiversity, whether that be policies or examples in Ontario?
Yeah, for sure. I will just speak about what I know, and I won't, I don't mean to suggest that it's the best or the only, but I'm very familiar with the City of Toronto's policies on this matter, where there is a biodiversity strategy, which is fantastic. And it was actually, there was an element in that strategy that led to the City of Toronto being required to reform its grass and weeds bylaw, because the biodiversity strategy said, take a look at all bylaws and see how they impact biodiversity. So right there, that biodiversity strategy called on the municipality, called on Toronto to take a look at its grass and weeds bylaw. And, obviously it had the bylaw had the effect of disincentivizing. And so the bylaw had to change. So City of Toronto also has a pollinator strategy, which started out independently, but then I think became part of the biodiversity strategy. And, the climate change policies. So I know that so those are the ones I know. That would be another great, I hope the OALA does maybe an educational webinar on these, and we can all learn about other, about the range of these policies across Ontario and the really best practices with them.
So that's,
sorry, Ryan, I was going to jump in to add that on the side, a number of members or attendees have given some ideas, and we've put out the links that they've provided. One is on the model law. So if people look in their questions area, they'll see those. We'll also find a way to put it in a newsletter. One's on the model law. There's one from the city of Barrie that was mentioned, and then it's also mentioned that in Prince Edward County, that only after a native garden was chopped down, that they're working also with the model law to try to incorporate that. So if you look in your chats, there have been some ideas to follow up on good examples for you. I'll note to both of you too that there are about 4 minutes left. And so I don't know, Rainer, if you want to focus on some of the big, I don't know if you had a chance on the side, look at a few of the big questions.
Yeah, I was just going to add before I go to the next question that you mentioned a lot of other policies that are supportive or that help guide the bylaw. I would assume that the more you can tie all those things in together into one package using different methods, the chances of success are probably higher.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Thanks for mentioning that. In terms of advocating, yeah, one of the most effective things you can do is actually point out to the municipality the way that these really wonderful policies actually are contradicted or are in conflict with the municipality's grass and weeds bylaw. Very powerful argument, one of the best. You can just like put aesthetics to the side and focus on these environmental policies.
Next question. The point made about having a list of plants to be avoided and prohibited is an interesting one and would add clarity. For example, there are countless properties in our area that have buckthorn growing, and it's unlikely the owners know about it or how to eradicate it. So again, the question is about the bylaw officers having the ability to identify prohibited and unprohibited. So you're saying part of the education, or I guess that's another way we can advocate if we are working, make the bylaw officer your friend rather than your foe.
Yeah, I would also just like to point out around that whole issue of the list of prohibited plants. I think it's crucial, and I think a step that municipalities are not automatically taking, but is utterly crucial, is in formulating such a list. I think it's crucial that municipalities actually do Indigenous engagement and work with certainly the treaty holders and other local Indigenous groups, organizations, and individuals in developing that list, and to make sure, for example, that list does not include medicine plants and food plants. And I just don't think it's possible to come up with I would urge municipalities, anyone engaged in this work, to not even begin to contemplate a list of prohibited plants without consulting Indigenous peoples, Indigenous rights holders.
Sorry, Ingrid, I guess could I ask one more question?
Yeah.
Okay, so the other one is about corporate social responsibility can be harnessed to encourage employees to get involved individually. How could this be promoted or encouraged corporately?
Oh, yeah. And again, I think landscape architects, you have an amazing role to play in that, and incredible, power. I know that, your work is driven by, corporate work is driven by budgets and clients' willingness to what's that phrase, think outside the box or whatever. But I think that by showing and by leading and by pointing out all of the fantastic habitat, really great, beautifully designed habitat spaces that landscape architects have been leading on, you can lead to change within the corporate sphere. Did that kind of get at what the question was asking? I feel like I might have veered off a little.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we're at 1 o'clock. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and especially thanks to Lorraine for giving her time. For me personally, this has been very informative. I know, having gone through the process, it can be a very painful one, but I think as long as you sort of stick to the knowledge and some of the resources you've provided, that can really help swing things in your favor, I think.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. And I apologize. I hope that the lights aren't kind of doing a strange thing. I haven't moved. The lights aren't flashing. They have, I don't know. There's something going on.
Yeah.
There's some weird energy happening, and I'm really sorry if it's been hard to watch as the light just changes randomly without touching anything or moving.
No problem at all.
Thank you
Thanks again.
again to you both, and to everybody for showing up. And we did put some answers, and we'll put those, like some of the links that you mentioned, Lorraine, we'll put them in our next newsletter, and they'll be available on the website. And it's true that you gave us many things to follow up on. So it should spur us. It's certainly given some inspiration for us to spur us on for more work.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. So long.